I'm delighted to be here, ladies and gentlemen. My name's David Wilkinson. I work for the so-called Joint Research Centre of the Commission. And our job is really to be the science service inside the Commission who provide the policy directorates general, of course including DG Environment and many others, with the scientific input they need in order to formulate good policy proposals based on sound science. There's an enormous demand, and a growing demand, I'm pleased to say, inside the European Union system for better scientific evidence. That's the good news. Here in Europe, we want to be a science-driven, or we want to have science-informed policies. But it's not an easy job. This is actually a picture of a little bridge in Iceland, which goes across between two different tectonic plates on the Earth. And you can see that bridge isn't going to last very long because those plates are moving along at quite a rate with respect to one another. And that sort of, well, you might think that's a river, but it's not a river. It's a sort of ground up paste of earth, soil, which has been formed by the rubbing together of these two plates. And it's a good analogy, I think, between the worlds of science and policy. They move along at different speeds, and they speak different languages. And I think this is a good story. Here we have somebody coming, arriving in a hot air balloon, and he says to the man on the ground, well, can you tell me where I am? I'm lost. And the man on the ground gives from his GPS machine the exact latitude and longitude, and he works out that he must be about 125 meters above sea level. So he's given a very precise answer. And the man in the balloon says, well, you must be a scientist. I ask you a simple question, and you give me too much information. I'm still lost. And then the response from the man on the ground is, well, you must be a policymaker. You came out of nowhere with your questions. I give you the most accurate and precise answer I can, and you're still lost, and you blame me. And I get the feeling that most people in the room are policymakers. There may be some scientists here, but you'll probably all recognize the truth of that story. On top of that, inside the EU, formally speaking, the policy cycle is very simple. Somebody formulates a policy, it's decided, of course, by Council and Parliament, it's implemented, monitored and evaluated, and then somebody says, shall we adjust the policy? So it's a simple process. But in practice, when you come to the everyday life inside the European Union system, you'll find many different interfering forces in that process, and we have to try and inject the science into that rather complex policy-making system. But what I'd really like to do today, and I don't want to take up too much time, Chair, because I appreciate you're going to try and run this as a panel session. But let me try and just give you a few specific examples. And in particular, I'd like to take the example of water availability. And there we have stresses and shocks to worry about. And resilience to those stresses and shocks is a big issue. At the same time, we need to strengthen our resilience approach inside the EU. And I'll tell you a little bit about what some of the opportunities might be and where we're going on that right now. First of all, I can tell you in our strategy inside the JRC, we've put resilience as one of three overarching themes: resilience, fairness, and competitiveness. And within that, one of our 10 priorities is focused on managing sustainable resources on the planet, and that's the part that I'm responsible for. And if you come to the issue of water, you can see, in fact, over the last 100 or so years, we're using more and more water per capita every year. And in fact, the growth rate, at least in most of the period, has been higher than the rate of growth of population. Agriculture, of course, is the big part of it, but not the only part, and we need water for industry, of course, and energy production, as well as at home, and when we also have to take into account, in fact, evaporation from artificial lakes. And in fact, during this year, the World Bank has produced a report, High and Dry it's called, which points out that economic growth is essentially dependent on water. Not everywhere in the world. And of course, it's clear that water is essential for providing energy, and we need energy, by the way, to provide fresh, clean water. It's also essential, obviously, for agriculture, but then again there's a feedback, because agriculture, as was already hinted at by Carl, is making a major negative impact on water purity in Europe. And then there's a link between food and energy as well. We need a lot of energy in the production of food, both in the farm and then in distribution and processing, but also now there's the new element of the equation: should we be using crops for producing energy? And certainly let's use as food waste for producing energy. Now, if you look at this map of Europe, you can see where the water shortages are. Spain, notably, parts of Italy, parts of Greece, Portugal, of course, and some other areas. That means that already today, in some parts of the EU, at some times of year, we have to drain off more water than there is available. And that's using essentially aquifer water, which may not be sustainable. We don't know how sustainable it is, because we don't know what's underground in terms of our water supplies. And many of our neighbouring countries have very significant water issues as well. It's going to get worse. Climate change is, whichever model you take, shows that we're going to have, in the parts of Europe which are already short of water, it will get worse. The parts where we don't have a fundamental water shortage will not be affected much, but those where we have a problem, it's going to get worse. And if we come now to look at the whole world, it becomes a real issue. This is actually 4 different potential scenarios, with taking into account climate change and population growth and so on. And in fact, you can see there that in every model, parts of Africa are going to become going to have significant more difficulty in providing enough water. Other parts of the world as well, and indeed this Mediterranean region, is going to maintain in all scenarios a worsening water situation. Where's that leading? It's leading to desertification. We already, if you believe it or not, only 2.7% of the total Earth surface can be used for growing food today, and it's going down. Soil is getting depleted for various reasons, and in fact, just to tell you that at the very end of this year, or the very beginning of next year, the Joint Research Centre will be publishing the World Atlas of Desertification, which I think will be an important indicator of how things are moving. What can we do about it? Well, one important thing, which we mustn't forget, and Carl already mentioned the circular economy. One tends to think of the circular economy as focused on extracting value from waste, but one of the most important sources of waste is wastewater, and we can reuse wastewater. Agricultural water can be used again in farming. Of course, we have to have the right standards, and the Commission is now working very actively to define exactly what those standards should be, to make sure that we can safely reuse water. There's a big potential gain if we can get water reuse moving forward. And in fact, you see there in Spain, 1,200 million meters cubed per year of water reuse potential, economically viable water reuse potential. So moving on that's very important. The other thing, and this is really a key issue, is making sure that we look at the water issue on a transboundary basis. Well, first of all, we have to abolish the silos between different policies. So water's not a policy on its own, it's part of a policy including energy production and agriculture. And we have to look across policies as far as water is concerned, and we have to look across national and international boundaries. In fact, this is part of the, this is an area which includes, you might be able to recognize it if your geography is good. That's Croatia with all those little islands down the side. There's Bosnia there, and Serbia, and Hungary, and Slovenia. So here it's not just inside the EU. Being inside the EU is obviously an important help, but Serbia is there as well, and not far along the Ukraine. We have to look at the whole water issue on a transboundary basis if we're going to make progress. And if we fight over water, then of course we're going to be in real trouble. That was a bit about stresses. Briefly on shocks. Every year the World Economic Forum published a global risk register. You can see up there, water crisis is always up there towards the top, high impact and high likelihood. It's not the very worst one this year, but it's still one of the serious ones, along with migration and failure to adapt to climate change. What does it mean? Well, of course, there are two types, really, floods and droughts. Two types of shock there. You can see that today floods is costing the EU 5 billion euros per year in economic output. Droughts 3, but both of those in all scenarios are predicted to increase dramatically. And you can see by 2050 we're looking at something like a 4 to 5 times expansion. In the JRC, we now have a flood warning system. That's very useful because it means that we can give typically 5, even sometimes 10 days warning of floods coming. The Paris floods, we were able to give nearly 10 days prediction. And that at least helps take necessary steps towards, for the member states to take steps towards mitigating problems. And also the Global Drought Observatory. Here we can predict the risk of droughts quite a while in advance by using satellite data for monitoring what's actually really going on closely with vegetation and predicted an actual rainfall data. And that's produced quite important data. And in particular, this year in January 2016, now looking again at the global issue, you can see there some areas of Africa really under threat from food shortages. And we have to look at this thing from a global perspective. It's no good saying, let's worry only about Europe and let the rest of the world take care of themselves. That is not going to work. As been said already, we're part of a globally connected network. Another good thing about the speech of Mr. Juncker, he announced 44 billion of potential infrastructure investments for our neighbouring countries, including Africa. And I think that's going to be a very important step towards global sustainability, and therefore a level of migration that can be managed. So that's stresses and shocks. Now, where can we go from here? You've probably seen in what I've been talking about, we do a lot of managing of data in the JRC. And the good news there is we have more and more data. If we can make sense of it, there's a potential to do quite a lot. One thing we've, in fact, just done, it's just finished now, is an analysis of 3 million Landsat satellite images. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the thing, it's corresponding to, well, there you are, you can see it in terms of 3-minute MP3 songs, it's 546 million songs. If you could listen to all of that, then you would have listened to the data in these different scenes. What we've been doing actually is processing it to identify where there is surface water and where it is dry, and how that's changing dynamically with time. How can you do all that processing? Well, the only way to do it today is with Google's Earth Engine, 45 days worth of time. If you take your PC and set it running now, even if it's a Core i7, we reckon it will take 1,212 years to produce the answer to this question. If Charlemagne had started it, then it would be just now coming to give us the answer. Of course, he didn't have an i7 computer at the time. But it's interesting to mention Charlemagne because he actually is the first person recorded in history to sign an international water treaty, which was signed to sort out a dispute on the River Rhine between different, I don't know, barons or whatever were around in those days, arguing about who was responsible for water. And of course, the people upstream have the kind of whip hand in that discussion. But Charlemagne came in and worked out that it would benefit both parties if they could agree between them along certain lines. And he basically imposed this model of water sharing. And you know, it's one of many water treaties at the international level that have been signed over the last 1,000 years. But it's fundamental to managing water on the planet. What comes out of this analysis of all this data? Well, it's very interesting. It turns out that several countries have lost an enormous amount of surface water. Where are they? Well, in fact, it turns out Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq are 3 of the countries most affected by loss of surface water. You know, is there a definite link between global or peace and lack of water? Can you prove it? Probably you can't. But you know, as a coincidence, it's very interesting. Some countries have got more water, quite a lot more water. Near the Himalayas, we find that there's a dramatic increase in surface water. And in fact, there's too much. It's actually now threatening livelihoods because farms and things are going under floods. Just to summarize the results of that analysis, it'll be published in Nature, I think, in the next couple of weeks. It turns out, actually, that on the surface of the Earth, there's now more surface water than there was 30 years ago. But, of course, it's not distributed where we would like it to be. And again, it's the same story. The countries that don't have enough are getting worse. And you can see there, in fact, 5 countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, are responsible for the lion's share of the loss of water. So we're drowning in data, but we're lacking wisdom. How can we sort of use it? Well, there are ideas, and here also working with Stockholm Resilience Institute, there are ideas for can we make a better model of the way the planet behaves, at least in some areas. And also Carl mentioned we have to take into account natural capital, human capital, social capital, as well as built infrastructure. We have to focus on well-being and not necessarily just GDP. What comes in? Nothing. Solar energy, that's the only thing. The only thing that goes out is waste heat. It's a closed model of the Earth. Maybe that's too ambitious, but there are people starting to think along those kind of lines. Can you use it to predict what's going to happen in 50 years' time? No. Can you use it to say whether a particular policy might help or hinder moving in the right direction? Well, perhaps you can. So modelling has its limits, but it can be very useful for comparing different policies. And already, for example, our climate change policies in the EU use quite sophisticated, not compared with this, but sophisticated models of energy use and their impact on climate to compare different policy options. Where are we now within the Commission? Well, resilience is moving up the agenda. I take note very much of what Carl said, that really it would be better to keep sustainability firmly on the agenda. But I think, it's an opportunity. Resilience seems to be making some impact on politicians. There are various initiatives now where resilience is being taken into account rather more inside the EU. Mainly, I have to say, at the global level, where it's good, but we could do with perhaps a bit more inside the EU. We've now organised, in fact, together with the organisation which Carl is now attached to. You better tell me what EPSC stands for, Carl, because I can never remember. European Policy Strategy Centre, part of the central part of the Commission, reporting direct to the President. And we're looking now with our different policy DGs, 23 different policy DGs involved in that, where to get input on where they see the resilience issue as most important. How's it going to work? Well, this comes now right back to the first talk. We really see a kind of a three-level approach. Promotion and protection, and transformation. I think you actually use slightly different words in yours, but I've got the feeling that we're on the same track of a three-tier approach to attacking resilience. This is the sort of idea that's being developed. I think it's very important. Can we cope with the initial shock? Can we rebound to initial shocks? Can we adaptively manage the next step? And then can we indeed transform completely our policy where we see the need for a bigger shift? I think that's everything I wanted to say, Chair, so thank you very much, everybody.